Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another wonderful history lesson with me, Miss Warren. Today, we are going to talk about how the maritime empires were able to maintain and continue developing during the 1450s to 1750s. So, we're going to be looking at the economic strategies they employed in order to consolidate and maintain their power. We're going to look at mercantilist policies and the joint stock companies and the continuities and changes in the networks of exchange. We're also going to be talking about this Atlantic trading system. Chartered European monopoly companies, the whole nine yards, because we know that, especially with the global silver trade, that it greatly expanded and greatly changed how the world interacted with one another. I mean, heck, Europe got China addicted to opium over silver. So we know it's a pretty big deal. So we're going to look at other factors that were affected in society based off of the political, economic, and cultural aspects, including any restructuring of, gender or family. So let's get at it, shall we? So, European empires were colonizing, and it was all based on this economic theory called mercantilism. And the main goal of mercantilism was that the mother country had a benefit, they gained in all of this. And they encouraged exports and they would accumulate bullion, so gold, and pure silver. And these raw materials were to be extracted from the colonies. And the finished goods would be produced in the mother country and then resold or retraded back to the colonies. So the new colonies would help expand their mother country's economic or economy, making the balance of power shift in the world towards Europe and away from everyone else. So it definitely was an imbalance between the mother country and the colonies, which is one of the reasons that led to the American Revolution, which, shocker, we're going to talk about in the next unit. Love these pictures, by the way. So you have heard of joint stock companies before. Nothing changes here. They were largely private-owned trading companies, and they did this because the journey took so long from the old world to the new, and it became so expensive and so high in risk that they wanted to spread the burden across many different people instead of one. So investors would buy stock in the company or in these specific sailing expeditions and taking on the risks in hope of earning a lot of money. So when things went right for investors, they earned a lot of money. When things went wrong, they only lost a little. So you have joint stock. Investors were only responsible for their personal investment. That's called limited liability. And as I said, you spread the burden of risk and the cost of the voyage among a large group of people, and that limited liability starts shrinking. This encouraged investment because it made it safer and less risky. So you removed this requirement for state sponsored voyages. Although the state still gave you their support, they no longer had to take on the risk of, financing these specific expeditions. And this is where you start to see the emergence of an early capitalist society come around. Private investment yields private money, like private growth in money, like people getting rich, essentially. So there were two main players during this time, and shocker, they were both East India companies. One was the English East India Company, and the other, the Dutch East India Company, or sometimes referred to as VOC. Don't ask me to pronounce it. It's not pretty. They established charters with their government, which allowed them to buy, sell, build trading posts, and make war in the company's best interest with the government support. That's the reason why you start seeing a lot of charter companies and stock companies building and opening colonies here in the Americas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So these are just some images and branding of the Dutch East India and the British East India Company. Now, you know that the Atlantic economy was all built off of the triangular trade system. This was the experimentation with, labor systems. They were able to use new forms of transportation, and they were able to, begin to establish this early capitalist enterprise, known as mercantilism. And all of this was combined to create a network of sea routes, the triangle between Europe, Africa, and the New World. From Europe to Africa, you would see the exchange of guns and textiles and manufactured goods. When you would get to Africa, Africa would send to the Americas via the Middle Passage enslaved Africans. And those Africans would actually bring foods with them, especially okra and rice, which would again change the Southern diet or change the diet of many Europeans and early Americans when this food would enter the New World. So the New World, in exchange, would send back, goods produced in the New World, which did include the raw materials. And these materials would include sugar, tobacco, cotton, rice, and of course, gold and silver. There would also be ships that crossed the Pacific. In particular, you would have, Spanish colony of Manila, which would become the capital of the Philippines, and they would end up trading silver for Asian luxury goods. Again, all comes back to silver. So, the Atlantic trading system applied capitalism and mercantilism across the Atlantic. Investors did seek profits in production and to export cash crops. And some of these cash crops were actually New World to Old, specifically tobacco. Tobacco would change a lot of the European landscape. And in Brazil, you would have the sugar. That's what would be their purpose, would be growing sugarcane. And this needed to be raised on large plantations. Raw sugarcane could not survive the ocean journeys, so it needed to be processed before it was shipped. So producers needed growing fields and a processing plant. So they had to have these large-scale operations, which meant large investments. Small farmers couldn't survive. So if you were growing and processing sugar, you had a very large operation, which also meant that it required labor, and that labor would come from slave labor, as we know. Now, the Great Dying is what we refer to when we talk about the indigenous populations here in the Americas. One of the biggest impacts Europeans had was the arrival of the deadly disease. Somewhere between 60 and 80 million died across the Americas. And one of the contributing factors to this is because Native Americans didn't domesticate animals. So because they didn't domesticate animals, it's suspected that they didn't build up an immunity or have an exposure to some of the diseases that were already present here or may have been present here, like smallpox and measles, the flu, malaria, so on and so forth. The indigenous people on Caribbean islands were gone in less than 50 years. Some areas lost almost 90% of their population. And the same was occurring in North America, just like it was in South America. The indigenous populations in the United States, it went from like 100 million Native Americans and different tribes and different languages and different cultures to like 10 million in the course of a century. And there's a lot of reasons for that one. You'll get into that in American history or US history. So the conquistadors claimed and discovered lands in the names of their empires, and it was mostly Spain because Portugal lost out on this one. The Portuguese were occupying Africa and Asia because they wanted to establish a trading post empire. So this is the reason why viceroys were appointed to administer and look over Brazil. And they were doing a pretty good job of it. The Spanish established two centers of authority, one in Mexico and one in Peru. Later, they would end up dividing their territory into four viceroyalties in the Audiencia of Chile, and they would end up building Mexico City on the old Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Yeah, you remember that modern marvel, Tenochtitlan, built in the middle of a lake. Yeah, they would end up building Mexico City on top of it. Yeah, no big deal. No big deal at all, right? And they would build administrative buildings in old Incan centers in Cuzco as well. The capital in Lima would be established along the coast for easier access. So these viceroys were kings, the king's representatives. Communication was often difficult between the king and the viceroys because, the distance. So it was the viceroys actually operated with a fair amount of independence. Viceroys set up governments in urban areas. They had a large bureaucracy that lived nearby. And until the 17th century, most officials were born in Spain. But over time, as the Spanish started to have children here, you started seeing these Creoles take over some of the authority in government. Now, there was, some urban settlement patterns in Brazil that were similar to what you would see in Europe. So Jesuits and priests arrived to convert the natives. So they set up residences and churches. And what you start to see emerge in Latin America is that the churches became the city centers. Priests saw to the spiritual needs of Europeans while also establishing schools so that the future generations that were born here could be educated. Then you have the Amerindians who were converted as a result of the close contact with these priests. Eventually, some priests protested the Spanish exploitation, however, and that's where you would have Father Hidalgo emerge. So this is an image or a drawing of the burning of sacred Mexican text by Catholic missionaries. This is the reason why we don't know a heck of a whole lot about the history of some of these civilizations, is because the Catholics and the Europeans came here and burned it all to the ground. So what about gender roles in the New World? Well, women were often traded and sold as slaves to European conquerors. Some elite women would actually marry European men as a method of cementing alliances. And this would happen between indigenous groups and new arrivals. Some, the average women, would be sold into slavery, they would be raped and abused, and they all had similar common fates. For those of you who want to know a little bit more about Christopher Columbus and the guy we celebrate, he would take children and sell them off to slavery or hand them over to his men. Sometimes wouldn't be just girls either. Just saying. As a result, this also led to this new racial social hierarchy that we have been talking about, due to the intermixing of enslaved Africans, natives, and Europeans. Also, due to the presence of the Inca in Mexico, the Spanish and Portuguese colonized the wealthiest lands in the New World, and they were able to establish cities and churches and universities long before British colonized North America. And the wealth was due to this commercial agriculture and the silver mining. And so you start to see the emergence before the chattel slavery had, really emerged. You saw the encomienda and the hacienda labor systems that were being utilized. And this meant that large estates employed native workers, but it ended up being just another form of slavery. So, what did the new social hierarchies look like? Well, we've talked about this. The social hierarchy was dictated by your birth location and the color of your skin. So, at the top of the pyramid were the peninsuales, who had most of the power, owned most of the land, and had all of the political authority. And they looked to Spain for guidance, but largely operated under unique circumstances and a lot of independence. Creoles were their children. They were Spanish, but they were born in the New World. And because of the lack of Spanish women meant that you saw a lot of men starting to take wives that were Native American or African. So the bottom of the pyramid gets a little interesting. So you have Peninsulales, you have Creoles, which were Spanish but born in the New World. Then you had the Mestizos, who were Spanish and Native American. And then you had the Mulattoes, which were Spanish with African. The Native American and enslaved. Why do you think that the Africans would be under the Native Americans? We're going to talk about that. So you've seen the Costas paintings before. This is nothing new. We've hit that one over the head quite a number of times. Shocker, the patriarchal society in the New World. So the father was the authority over the children. Women couldn't hold any positions of power. They couldn't run plantations or mines. Women couldn't control their own dowry. They did control their own dowry, and they could run businesses after their husband died, but it was, kind of taboo, and they were expected to remarry so the man could come in and take over. Women did have full rights to inheritance to a point. European women were also considered bearers of civilization. Ugh, this makes me feel some sort of way. There was a transmitted male wealth, honor, and status by birthing legitimate children. Children were born in wedlock, not out of wedlock. And there was this belief of the purity of the blood. And this was a major concern because in Spain, the concern was, Muslims mixing with Muslims and Jewish people. In the New World, it was mixing with Africans and indigenous people. So that's kind of the reason why in some parts of Latin America, especially in Brazil, you start to see even current society still has this mindset of, how much blood, like the one drop rule. Do you have one drop or do you have, more or less? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's talk about belief systems and patterns that emerged here. So natives were at the bottom of the totem pole in the social hierarchy. Populations were destroyed by diseases. Those who were left behind were forced into agricultural labor and mining. They were forced to convert to Christianity. Some converted willingly. Some did not. The Spanish refused to recognize female property or even inheritance rights of natives. Christian saints were blended with indigenous gods to create this new syncretic belief system. You had Tupac Amaru, who revolted in Peru in 1780. And it showed how unhappy the indigenous people were and how willing they were to defend their traditions. Didn't end very well for him. The story of the Virgin of Guadalupe actually illustrates the syncretism here in the New World. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So voodoo is actually one of my most favorite and interesting kind of synchronous beliefs here in the New World. So voodoo has roots in West and Central Africa. So this is where most Haitian ancestors were born. And when the Roman Catholic European colonizers brought over, these Africans to the New World and introduced them to the French who colonized the western third of Hispaniola, you start to see a unique blend of beliefs and practices emerge. So the religion honors the supreme creator God who is considered too remote to reach directly. So worshippers have these intermediate spirits, such as the Orisha gods of the Yoruba people who inhabited what is now Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, and figures from Haitian history. So the faith is very much decentralized and it is practiced creatively and not prescriptively like most other religions in the world. So this helps to account for the differing forms that were practiced elsewhere, like New Orleans. So like many great religions throughout history, Haitian voodoo has provided both solace and an intimate sense of community to the oppressed. Voodoo is not to be feared. Voodoo is not to be feared. So the British would end up arriving to North America rather late, and they kind of got the leftovers of the New World because nobody had really explored above what is now modern day Florida. So when the English arrived, which had experience with Protestant and Catholic conflicts, as well as the creation of a parliament which checked the power of the king. So you had Puritans and Quakers who wanted to escape the old European society rather than recreate it, setting up shop here. They had a less class hierarchies than the Spanish or Portuguese. Men had more freedom in the New World, and women still lived very much within that old patriarchal confines of society. So, as more British people settled in North America, you started to see that more British were coming here than Spanish settlers. And Amerindian populations were decimated, crushed. We talked about that. Less slaves were needed as many farms were much smaller and much more independent. So both of these led to less racial mixing that became prevalent in, the Latin American colonies. So there was no creation of this casta system here in North America. So most settlers were Protestant and they were not interested in converting the native people. They're just promoting, they were more like promoting literacy. Church and state were not as closely connected as they were in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And they had a stronger tradition of self-government because Britain had been through so many civil wars prior to this. So if you're comparing the two sides, you start to see that Latin America kind of walked, right? So North America could run with it. You had Latin America, you had the comuna, the mita system, slave labor, single men and soldiers married native women. They had an authoritarian government, no assemblies with elaborate bureaucracies. Amerindians were forced into labor. You had a very strict social hierarchy. And Jesuits were responsible for setting up most of the towns in Latin America. But in North America, you saw slavery and indentured servants. Families came from, Europeans. There was less intermarriage and racial mixing. Government was much more independent because that's the way they had lived. Amerindians were kind of just pushed aside and not really used for labor. Then you have the social hierarchy that was